Hi everyone, my name is Gwen Varley and I'm a PhD student, soon to be graduate of the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich. And today I'll be drawing from a portion of my thesis, specifically speaking about how insights from the reproductive justice movement challenge instrumentalism and reveal connections between women's empowerment and children's nutrition in Busoga, Uganda. So I'd like to start with the theoretical foundation of the relationships between women's empowerment and children's nutrition. When these two topics are researched in tandem, we often see it framed as women's empowerment being the explanatory variable and children's nutrition being the response variable. That is, that improvements in women's empowerment can lead to improvements in children's nutrition. But because my research focuses on women's empowerment as an important development outcome in its own right, not just as a tool for achieving other development outcomes, I'm also very interested in the reverse relationship, whether improvements in children's nutrition can lead to improvements in women's empowerment. This is a framing that is much less commonly discussed, but it's one that I hope to shed some light on today. So let's begin with how the relationships between women's empowerment and children's nutrition are currently theorized. These theories can be roughly categorized into three pathways to improving children's nutrition. The first is that women, usually mothers, are often children's primary caregivers. The second is that women make significant physiological contributions to children's health. And the third is that women tend to allocate household resources in ways that benefit children's nutrition. The first pathway is based on the assumption that a woman, usually the mother, will be the child's primary caregiver. And this is arguably the most widespread rationale for linking women's empowerment to children's nutrition. If mothers have the most direct control over what a child does or does not eat, as well as other aspects of overall health, then it may appear sensible to target the bulk of, say, nutrition, behavioral change communications at mothers of young children. And in a lot of literature, this is treated as an obvious point that doesn't need further clarification or exploration. But even if we overlook the question of whether mother should be synonymous with caregiver, another difficulty with the caregiving pathway is that the theorized relevance of women's caregiving to women's empowerment is that when women become empowered in some other area of their lives, they will automatically also become, quote unquote, better caregivers. And even if we leave aside for the moment the question of whose vision of ideal caregiving is being fulfilled here, it's difficult to identify a link between empowerment and caregiving without incorporating resources like income or time, which is the basis of the third pathway. In other words, what is it about the act of caregiving itself, aside from making decisions about how to spend money or how to spend time, that has anything to do with empowerment? But for now, let's move on to the second pathway, which is based on the premise that women's health and actions, especially during pregnancy and breastfeeding, have a unique role in impacting on the health of fetuses and children. And this is part of the emphasis on the first 1,000 days, the developmental origins of health and disease, and epigenetics more broadly. And the connection to women's empowerment is the idea that improving women's health is inherently empowering for women. However, it's also important to remember that women's health, while of course very important, is at best a proxy indicator of empowerment. It may be advantageous, but not necessarily sufficient for exercising agency and experiencing empowerment. And two major drawbacks of this theory are, one, that it only incorporates forms of empowerment that improve women's health, and two, not even overall health or the health of all women, but rather select aspects of health of the women who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or have the potential to be. So the scope for empowerment here, based on this pathway, is actually very narrow, and women's health could even improve while negligibly improving women's empowerment. So the third pathway maybe seems more promising for providing a robust connection to women's empowerment because it focuses on women's control over resources, especially income and time. However, even in cases where women are struggling with extreme economic poverty and time poverty, increasing their access to those resources isn't necessarily going to lead directly to improvements in children's nutrition, in part because they're also trying to meet other pressing needs like paying for clothing, bedding, healthcare, and education, and often facing extraordinarily difficult decisions about how to manage those trade offs. But even presuming that women increase their income and flexible time by such orders of magnitude that they're able to meet all of those needs easily, there's still the question of whether women will choose to allocate resources toward improving a child's diet or to something else. And if conditions are attached to those resources, such as giving vouchers that can only be spent on nutritious foods, then women's empowerment actually decreases because their choices are more limited. So, in other words, the framing here is instrumentalist, that we want to expand women's choices, but only if they're making choices that improve children's nutrition. So, these three pathways set up a rather uneasy relationship between women's empowerment and children's nutrition, wherein a development intervention based on the second or third pathway might increase women's empowerment, or it might have no effect or even decrease women's empowerment. And the first pathway doesn't give us a clear roadmap for improving women's empowerment at all. And it's my suspicion that this shaky theoretical foundation is at least partially responsible for some of the mixed results we've seen in the literature thus far on women's empowerment and children's nutrition. So, what could be a better alternative? I argue that using a reproductive justice framework allows us to form a much clearer and simpler conceptualization of the relationship between women's empowerment and children's nutrition, and hopefully, as a result, be able to design more rigorous development interventions that actually address both issues more comprehensively. So, what is reproductive justice? Very quickly summarized, the reproductive justice movement formed in the US during the 1990s in response to the pro choice reproductive rights movement. Founded by feminists of color, the movement regarded reproductive rights narratives as too narrow, focusing too heavily on access to abortion and reflecting the relative privilege white American women had to provide for and protect their children as they wished. In contrast, many women of color felt that they had insufficient agency to choose not only if or when to become a parent, but how to parent. These principles have also been phrased as the right to not have a child, the right to have a child, and the right to parent with dignity. So that includes not only access to the means to prevent pregnancy or childbirth for those who want to do that, but also for those who do want to become a parent, access to adequate health care, including mental health care, adequate support from your family and community relationships, the ability to keep your child well nourished and in school, and the ability to keep your child safe, protected from violence or environmental harm. And this framing also requires a focus on intersectionality, analysis of systems of power, and centering the experiences of people who are the most marginalized. So, when we start from the standpoint of asking how we can empower women to choose if they want to be a parent in the first place, when they want to have a child, and how we can assist women in parenting in whatever way suits them best, then the connections between women's empowerment and children's nutrition become a lot clearer. And this framework gives us a much broader view of women's roles as mothers in terms of time, meaning we're not just narrowly focused on the first 1,000 days, we're also looking at life stages before and after that, and we're also including women who never get pregnant at all. And we also have expanded views of topics connected to nutrition. So, not just strictly food related activities, but also other caregiving concerns. And we also have an expanded structural view. We're not just looking at individual women's decision making, but also the environmental factors over which she has no direct control. And this framework crucially differs from the previous three we looked at in that it doesn't use any instrumentalist framings of women's empowerment. There's an understanding that each individual woman will have vastly different answers to the questions of if, when, and how they want to become a parent. And so we can't make sweeping generalizations about how women's empowerment as a whole relates to children's nutrition as a whole. but I argue it still provides a powerful tool for understanding relationships between women's empowerment and children's nutrition, because many women will choose to become a parent, and nearly all parents want their children to be healthy. But even among those women who do enthusiastically become parents, there will be a wide range of answers to the how question. And importantly, I think this framework is a more ethically sound approach to designing development interventions, because when women are active participants in choosing how to improve their children's health, there's much less risk of inadvertently or negligently improving children's nutrition at the expense of women's empowerment. And that's because the choices that a woman does or doesn't want to make are established at the outset. So, with those principles in mind, I'd like to share a glimpse of some of the qualitative results we produced when investigating the relationship between women's empowerment and children's nutrition through a reproductive justice lens in Busoga, Uganda. To briefly give a little context, Busoga is a region in eastern Uganda, and specifically we were working in Bujiri district, and the map on the right gives a rough idea of the location of the communities where we conducted this research in relation to Bujiri, the district capital. So these results come from 30 in-depth, semi-structured interviews with women between the ages of 18 and 46, who all had at least one child under the age of 4. And these 30 women were a subset from a larger quantitative study that was conducted on nutrition and empowerment. So in this context, some of the topics that we were specifically interested in asking about in relation to reproductive justice were family planning, gendered caregiving roles, polygyny, and women's parenting aspirations. So let's look at family planning as an example. We asked women whether they were happy with their current family planning methods, and they were about evenly split. Half were satisfied and half were not. Those who were happy said they were able to communicate openly with their partner, and those who were using contraceptives said that they valued being able to space their children how they wanted. For example, to wait until the youngest child is old enough to go to school before having another. And some women even drew a direct connection between birth spacing and the health of all of their children. So I'll give you a moment to read this quote here. And conversely, women who said they weren't using contraceptives cited spacing as one of the reasons they wished they could use family planning, because they might want to have another child in the future, but they were getting pregnant before they were ready. And when we asked about what the barriers were to having their family planning needs met, some did mention resistance from their partners, but others also described having negative side effects to the contraceptives, hearing rumors that contraceptives cause diseases, and receiving discouragement from medical professionals. And all those things can cause women to feel that family planning is not a viable option for them individually, even if they desire the benefits resulting from family planning. And more than once, women described themselves as failing at family planning rather than family planning failing them. So, given these responses, there appears to be an opportunity in Busoga to bundle reproductive healthcare with nutrition messaging as a comprehensive package of resources for helping women to parent if, when, and how they wish to. For such a program to be successful, it would be essential to provide these resources in such a way that women feel encouraged and empowered to voice their own needs and aspirations and receive healthcare and information that are tailored to them. And I wish I had time today to share the responses we received from women on all of these topics and more, because it really is such a rich and informative data set, but I hope that I've at least piqued your interest on these topics, and I'm very happy to talk about them more in the Q&A. And I'll end by just emphasizing once more that each of these topics was absolutely critical for understanding the full picture of what Busoga women were experiencing regarding their empowerment and their children's health, but they're topics I would not have necessarily thought to ask about without a reproductive justice framing, and that I would have had a lot of difficulty analyzing in accordance with the three common theorized pathways that I described at the beginning. So, in summary, I would argue that a reproductive justice framework is useful for investigating these topics both from a theoretical standpoint, because its conceptual logic is so much simpler and clearer, as well as from a practical standpoint, because in the example of Busoga, it brought up entire avenues of relevant research questions that might not otherwise get explored. And I'll conclude there. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A.